Tonight on Global Perspectives, we are focusing on a health topic that affects more than 350 million people around the world, having the potential to destroy lives whether you are at the bottom of the social ladder or even at the very top. In early October, the daughter of the famous Indian singer Asha Bhosle committed suicide. She reportedly was diagnosed with depression and receiving treatment. And she is not the only high-profile person to have been affected by depression. In the late 90s, the former Norwegian Prime Minister made headlines when he decided to publicize his struggle with the illness.
I thought maybe this can be a contribution to fight stigma. If a Prime Minister is open about his illness, that can help others.
The often debilitating condition is on the rise globally. So much so that the World Health Organization describes it as a global crisis. It was the theme of this year's World Mental Health Day. On this episode of Global Perspectives, we are taking a closer look at what depression is and how it affects us. We'll take a look at the science and social aspects of dealing with this very common illness. We'll also be speaking with Sean Humphreys, the media coordinator at Sri Lanka's National Mental Health Institute in Angoda, to see how we can create more awareness. How do we know when depression is affecting us or a loved one? What should we do to seek help? And perhaps most importantly, how do we work towards lessening the strong stigmas that are often associated with mental illnesses, particularly in this part of the world? That's what's ahead on Global Perspectives tonight.
Good evening and welcome once again to Global Perspectives. October 10th was World Mental Health Day. The World Health Organization organizes it annually to increase public awareness about mental health issues. This year, WHO decided to focus particularly on depression as its theme. Tonight, we have a very interesting show that will look into various aspects of mental illnesses, from its biology to social perspectives. But before we get into all that, let's take a quick look at what constitutes depression.
Depression is difficult to define. A wide variety of symptoms can affect different people in different ways, and many of the symptoms can be mistaken for just having a bad day. What could start with a bad mood for a few days could at its worst end in a suicide.
Depression is a very common illness in which people feel down, depressed and hopeless and take much less pleasure and interest in doing the normal things in life that they find interesting and pleasurable than they would do normally. And it goes on for more than 2 weeks, because we all have bad days when we feel a bit low, and if that goes on for a day or two, that's unfortunate, but it's life. But whereas if you have those feelings and they go on for more than 2 weeks, that's probably depression.
The idea that depression is caused by chemical imbalances in the brain started coming to light around the 1950s. Since then, doctors have been able to determine the nature and causes of depression, making it very possible for people affected by the illness to live normal lives.
I think we would tend to divide depression up into mild, moderate and severe, and mild depression is very common, and people can have mild depression and will often recover with some self-help measures that they can institute themselves over a couple of weeks. So it's very common in general practice to see someone who's depressed, and if you give them some simple measures to look after themselves, they will recover. When they come back in a couple of weeks, they're much, much better. Someone who's moderately depressed may recover with those measures or may need some help with under medication or talking treatment, whereas someone who's severely depressed almost certainly will need both medication and talking treatment to help them get better and help them stay better in the future.
Taking it even further, advanced technologies are now also enabling physicians and neurologists to monitor brain activity so closely that they can even determine what parts of the brain causes certain symptoms, which can then be used to develop better targeted treatment. Despite such advances in medicine, though, the World Health Organization reports that a vast majority of people affected by depression still don't have access to the resources of information or treatment to fight it. In some countries, less than 10% of people with depression are ever treated.
Our guest tonight is Mr. Sean Humphreys, the media coordinator at Sri Lanka's National Mental Health Institute in Angoda. He is working in Sri Lanka as a Canadian volunteer for Voluntary Service Overseas, or VSO. In this first segment, we talk about the importance of creating more awareness of mental health illnesses. How prevalent is it in our part of the world, and how to fight the stigmas? I was wondering if we could start off with, because I'm under the impression, and I might be wrong here, that there's some misconceptions about what actually constitutes depression, and I wondered if you could start off by giving us an accurate definition of what actually constitutes depression.
Sure. So depression is actually that one of the issues behind why depression isn't really that well known is that there's a lot of different symptoms that contribute to it. And so for one person, symptoms might be the sign of depression or it might not be. So some of the typical symptoms that people see that have depression would be things like a loss of appetite, things like lack of sleep, just a general feeling of sadness. And where the depression comes in is where that is prolonged for a period of time. It's normal for people to feel all those things throughout the course of a day or a week or through the year. But when depression, where that becomes the problem or the issue, is when usually those types of symptoms last for more than 2 weeks at a time. So it's more of a prolonged period. And again, there isn't one of the problems is that there isn't like a set definition for things like things like cancer, things like more physical ailments, where you can say, okay, this is cancer, this is heart disease. Depression is different because there's various symptoms and each person is affected differently.
I do want to talk a little bit more about the symptoms and the signs, if you will.
Sure.
But before that, now, for the World Health Organization to choose this as a global theme, and they describe it as a global crisis, it must be a very prevalent problem throughout the world. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the global situation with regards to depression, and perhaps if you do have some information with regard to the South Asian region and Sri Lanka in particular?
For sure. So I think it's one of those diseases that is starting to be talked about now, a lot more widespread, where in the past things like depression, other mental illnesses really weren't talked about. And so because now there's been more statistics coming out, we're starting to see that this is how big of a problem this is. So the WHO estimates that depression impacts 350 million people worldwide. Which is quite a large percentage of the population, and they predict also that by 2030, so just over 15 years, it's going to be the leading cause of all diseases in the world. So it's going to be, they see it, they predict that it's going to get even worse before it gets better. And when you look at South Asia and Sri Lanka in particular, that problem is similar for sure. There's the statistics from South Asia, from Sri Lanka, sometimes aren't the most reliable, but there are the best guesses that we have from the different bodies. It puts it between 15 to 25% as far as the population that's impacted by it. Reason why that number isn't quite concrete, and why it's not really concrete worldwide, is that still people aren't seeking treatment, and so the numbers of people with mental illness, with depression, just aren't counted because they're either dealing with it in different ways, or they're just kind of putting it under the rug and not really addressing the problem. So there's no way for mental health professionals, for the governments, to know the exact numbers. But it's definitely a growing problem in the world, and South Asia is no different.
The fact that it's difficult to find accurate numbers, is one reason the fact that it is something that has a stigma attached to it, particularly in this part of the world. I mean, oftentimes I know here, I can speak for Sri Lanka, that if somebody says I'm going to a therapist or something for depression, it's sort of looked upon as, oh really, then you must have something wrong with you or something like that. I mean, do you find that might be one of the reasons? I
think it is probably the biggest reason, I would say, is the stigma, is the shame, is the discrimination that comes towards people that have mental illness, or towards their families. When someone has mental illness in their family, it actually, for most people I talk to, it's the hardest thing to do. And statistics show that people say that the actual stigma attached to mental illness is actually worse than the symptoms itself. And so that means the feelings of, when you look at depression, the feelings of loneliness, the feelings, just not having an appetite, being sad all the time, they'll deal with those on their own because they don't want to actually admit they have a problem and that they need treatment. And so that just proves and shows how real that stigma is, and how devastating it can be when someone does need treatment, when they do need either to speak with someone or they need some medicine to help with their condition.
In your opinion, what do you think is the biggest myth that we have with regards to depression in particular?
I think the fact is that it's a sign of weakness. I think that's the biggest, and that's a myth that exists around the world, is that if someone is feeling depressed or is depressed, that they're somehow looked at as being weak, as being not a valid person in a way. And I think that is the biggest myth, is that it's actually an illness. It's something that's either a chemical imbalance in the brain, or it's something that you've been through a traumatic event and you need help. It's just like a broken arm. You wouldn't sit and wait if you broke your arm and not get treatment. Depression is the same. If you're feeling those prolonged symptoms for a long period of time, you need to seek treatment and to seek help. And so getting over that stigma is a very difficult thing. I mean, it's not easily done. It comes with education, it comes with awareness raising, it comes with things like World Mental Health Day, where people stand up who've had mental illness and say, I have had mental illness, I've sought treatment for it, and I've recovered. And they can see these people, in their own communities, in their own villages, in their own temples, and that's where the real learning and the real kind of teaching happens, is at that level.
When we come back, we're going to see how having a mental illness, in particular depression, is not just a crazy state of mind like it is so often portrayed to be. A look at the science behind the illness when we come back. You're watching Global Perspectives on MTV Sports. Here in Sri Lanka, you cannot talk about mental illnesses without talking about Angoda. And even though the facilities at Angoda offer invaluable services, it has unfortunately acquired a notorious reputation. You can almost never bring up the name without hearing a giggle or an insensitive remark. And that is mainly because mental illnesses have for so long and are still so often portrayed as a crazy state of mind. In this segment, we thought we'd bring you an excerpt from a special series that the Charlie Rose Show on America's PBS station did earlier this year, called the Brain Series. In this episode on depression, we'll see how mental illnesses are not just a state of mind, but are very real biological and more so neurological problems.
Could actually literally say, when you're depressed, what areas of the brain aren't working properly. Take a very simple-minded point of view.
This is really a wonderful point, because many people don't appreciate this. But one of the ways pathologists distinguish between psychiatric and neurological illnesses in, let's say, 1890, 1900, is they would take patients who died of neurological illness or psychiatric, they would cut the brains. If they saw a large hole in it, they knew it was a neurological disease, because most neurological diseases cause significant localized anatomical changes.
That was the old joke, actually.
That's right.
If you could cut it and see it, it was neurology. If you could treat it, it was psychiatry.
Also, if you didn't see it, you cut the brain and you didn't see anything obvious, because as we now learn, these are more subtle changes, then it was a psychiatric disorder. And it wasn't until functional imaging came along, and this is why Helen's works were so extraordinary, that you could really define a neural circuit involved in a disorder by using imaging.
I mean, it's really remarkable. Freud, Wernicke, Alzheimer's, everyone knew these were brain disorders.
Yes.
They were all cutting brains way back. They just couldn't find anything and needed other theories to actually accommodate what they knew to be true. And this is the remarkable issue about the time we live in. We now have tools that allow us to test what we know to be true.
Freud knew